session. So I'll begin my talk. It's titled COVID-19 and the Plight of Manual Workers. So everyone remembers the difficulties manual and skilled workers faced during March and April 2020, and it went on into the summer. So bureaucrats and politicians often get a bad reputation, and this is not unusual. As files are always pending, money changes hands, the relation between politicians and bureaucrats is disliked by the general public because it takes away questions of autonomy, of occupation, and freedom of speech. Women are often marginalized. Nepotism and clan loyalties are seen to be normal, as is the favoring of friends and loyal subordinates. So this is not unfamiliar to us. It's the fact of everyday existence, and we deal with it as best as we can. So Max Weber defined bureaucracy as entailing a system of rules, codification, accounting and ledger keeping, objectivity, time or clock rules. That is, we are uh, on in terms of industrial time or factory time defined by the clock, measurement and accuracy as index of modernity. So the contract is the best example of legal domination. It is that aspect of bureaucracy that is best known. So bureaucracy is about types of legitimate domination. Domination is the probability that certain specific commands or all commands will be obeyed by certain persons. So obedience intrinsically implies consent. So there is an interest in obedience. So Weber argues that there is a mutual comprehension of the rules which are laid down. So who lays down the rules? That is of central interest to you as a community. So authority and its order represents the organization and its staff, which is present. So Weber always makes a distinction between power and authority, and we are interested in the way in which power through legal means becomes forms of authority. So this is a group which is specialized to carry out the commands and to execute specific policy. So that is why when we try to understand the role of bureaucracy during COVID-19, it becomes extremely significant to us. So material interest is not a sufficient criterion, nor is fear. So people don't follow orders either because of material interest or fear, but there is a canon of rules by which this is dispensed. So something larger keeps the organization together. And these elements are emotion as well as ideal attributes. People have to feel deeply about something. There has to be a sense of belonging. There has to be a sense of normative spaces which are implied through rule keeping. So there is also the presence of custom and traditional habits, and this complicates the issue somewhat because as soon as we speak of custom and traditional habits, then we will see that there is also the expectation of personal advantage. Tying it all together is the belief in its overall legitimacy. So how do we understand the relationship between tradition, convention, customs, moral order, and the preoccupation that we do have with the question of human rights? How do we link them together? So authority rests on consent, and it will be different in each location. So this is a very simple sociological premise that whether we are talking about authority or whether we are talking about the existence of God, all of these will be reflected in terms of the conventions that are followed at any given place. So the authority that the director of an organization has over the clerks is different from that which informs the relationship between lord and vassal or lord and slave. So this is the forms of legitimate authority. It is a form of rational authority. It is the way in which we understand modern bureaucracy, even in postmodern societies. And we all agree that the nature of these rational systems are extremely important to us. So Satish Sabharwal argued in a book called Wages of Segmentation that bureaucracy in India is enmeshed in village authority, in caste and clan loyalties. So industrialization was imposed on us through colonialism, and the real truth is that it happened in a very short period of time, because if the steam engine was invented in 1848, India received trains by 1850. So the whole question of industrialization being imposed on us, the real adaptative process never took place. So the West had 400 years to adapt to factory and laboratory. But in India, it was imposed on us from above with no democratic or engaged discussion. So it doesn't matter who the ruler is, it doesn't matter who carries the cloak of authority. The very basis of the adaptation that we experience in terms of the relationship that exists between post-industrial laboratory negotiation with traditional forms of existence and occupation is what we are really interested in. So Weber states that there is an appropriate attitude and a corresponding one in conduct. And the mesh of everyday reality, the way in which we understand media, the way in which we interact with each other, all of this represents the very complex social relationships that are generated. So loyalty may be hypocritical or it may be opportunistic and marked by self-interest. How do we engage with the varieties of ways in which people may remain loyalty to one traditional form or the other, or the customs that are generated by this loyalty to tradition? How do we engage with this? People may submit because there is no alternative. So it may be out of fear or helplessness because the type of authority exhibited is seen as valid, whether customary or legal. And I think there's a distinction between these. They admit that they are subservient, they accept authority, relationships which are seen to be consensual, where the subject confirms his or her submission. So obedience means, according to Weber, that the form and the content of imposition coincide and the command is the basis of any action performed for its own sake. So let me repeat, obedience means that the form and the content of imposition coincide and the command is the basis of any action performed for its own sake. So there's already a relationship of hierarchy which is established here. So Weber argues that what is registered is the formal aspect of content, not the negotiatory attitude of the actor in relationship to the value. So there's just so much confusion, so much questioning, so much doubt, so much continuous negotiation. But for him, what is significant is the content of the command. So you have the work of Hannah Arendt in the trial of Eichmann, who writes that the bureaucrat is never responsible for the order which comes from above, that carrying the order forward is something that he sees as a relationship of consent in view of the possibility that he could question that order. So Weber also states that the chief and his staff presenting themselves as servants to those they rule does not take away the aspect of domination. So this question of domination may be represented in a variety of forms. And what we are interested in is how this is imposed on the general community. So the whistleblower has charismatic power and is welcomed by citizens because he or she is fearless and able to communicate his version, his or her version, in opposition to that of the partisan bureaucrat. So there's just so much literature that you've already been exposed to, I'm sure, in your line of work, where the question of what is truth, what is the basis of information and dissemination, all of these then return to the ways in which power is conceded, but authority may be questioned. So robber barons use state machinery to get past law in the contract by saying that the people need it. So very often the language of surveillance of power is represented as something which is of immediate and urgent use value. So robber barons, and we see them all the time. We read about them. We see documentaries about them. We see fictionalized representations of them. So they revel in saying that they break rules, and this is obviously illegal, but they are able to communicate this very powerfully. So in the same way, the bureaucrat in judicial positions can clear the actions of his criminal patrons because there are no witnesses and their families have been killed, neglected, or silenced. So the partisan bureaucrat, and here I put dash and say politician because it could be substitutable. The partisan bureaucrat politician, when acting in a friendly and intimate fashion, can reorder reality by promoting the good of some people over the good of the citizens whom he purportedly serves. So there is an intimacy, there's a colloquiality, there's a way of communicating things very clearly, and there is in some senses the need to be able to analyze this. So in the 40s and 50s, sociologists were not very keen to analyze forms of speech because they thought that the representational forms of speech could never really be confirmed, and that action was what sociologists needed to work with. But from the 80s onwards, the whole question of the Speech Act became very, very significant, because we could see that it would be inscribed, or it would be remembered, or it could be verified, confirmed, rechecked, and misinterpretation itself became a whole field by which sociologists could engage with polysemy, or the varieties of ways in which people wish to interpret statements as they were given. So the partisan bureaucrat politician, when acting in a friendly and intimate fashion, can reorder reality by promoting the good of some people over the good of the citizens whom he or she purportedly serves. Since the process of going to the courts is a disruption of daily duties and obligations, the bureaucrat politician, as robber baron, who has government employees as lawyers working for him, can create tremendous obstacles to real issues from surfacing. So the power of the people is always mediated by their ability to engage with the courts in terms of time, in terms of money, in terms of their sense of confidence about using linguistic facilities which may or may not be available to them. So the robber baron, bureaucrat, or politician represents himself or herself as the government, and he or she acts on behalf of the state. But in reality, he or she projects a reality or a worldview that is both unethical and illegal. So you as young people know that the future lies ahead of you, and that the conservation of the spaces that have been fought for in terms of human rights, in terms of feminist battles to be seen, heard, recognized, all these lie ahead of you. So since bureaucracy and its contracts are linked with personages and with codified or inscribed manuals, the robber baron bureaucrat politician is well able to relieve honest officers of their duty, or to transfer them where they cannot be of harm to him or her. Yet, even with this digitalization of files, and that is a completely different area which one can engage with, even with digitalization of files, all materials are up for scrutiny. And so opaque and self-gratifying acts become visible to all unless we are functioning in an oligarchy. Now, with this framework in mind, we can well understand why food distribution to people in camps or villages was not made possible, why 44,000 crores was made unavailable for this purpose, and millions of workers were forced to walk back home. So all this is very intense for you even now, because obviously it's a continuing space that we all live in, and we adapt to it and we make sense of it as best as we can. So let's look at COVID-19 in terms of two themes. That is the relationship that exists between disease and fate. So the second problem, the idea of fate, the idea of social hierarchy, is closely related to the idea of social distance, magnified by physical distance and occupational prescriptions. So we are talking about ways in which ideologies can influence us, how cultural matrix can place us where we are. So what then is a relationship between caste-based occupation in relationship to class? The working class is defined not by its access to consumption, but its distance from it. It is alienated from its work during COVID-19 and exposed to tremendous risk as migrant workers in between the safe spaces of territorial jurisdiction marked as point of origin and the point of arrival for work. So they have to negotiate what are sometimes encyclopedic spaces, which are culturally very, very different. So Paul Gilroy calls this the time between camps. And I quote him to say that citizenship degenerates into soldiery The political imagination is entirely militarized. The exaltation of war and spontaneity, the cults of fraternity, youth, violence, the explicitly anti-modern sacralization of the political sphere, and its civilization and its colonization by civil religion, involving uniforms, mass spectacles, all underline that these camps are fundamentally martial phenomena. So let me read it for you again. It's a quote from the book Between Camps. So he says that citizenship degenerates into soldiery. The political imagination is entirely militarized. The exaltation of war and spontaneity, the cults of fraternity, youth, violence, the explicitly anti-modern sacralization of the political sphere, and its colonization by civil religion involving uniforms, mass spectacles, all underline that these camps are fundamentally martial phenomena. They, the life in the camps, become an unforgiving motion towards the next demanding phase of active conflict. So we see that there is a movement forward, and it is seen as a necessary movement, and the young particularly are engaged in this act of either legitimation, consensus, acceptance, or the possibility that they do not accept are then seen to be as problems to the system. So the impact of COVID-19, the life in the camps, led to greater surveillance and as a consequence to questions about agrarian conflict, where the questions are not just about federal politics, but engages us with larger questions about financial resolutions, which are not embodied in democratic politics. So it is really the ways in which we think about imposition of laws and rules and the ability of the citizenry to speak back. So is that a possibility? Is free speech available to us? Is there a democratization of politics through the many strands which are then generated by the imposition of laws from above? So different and opposing nationalism, which are historically defined, become interlaced in a mutual enmity. And I think this is very interesting because we see that there are so many differences among us, and yet we are able to correspond with one another, to form relationships of solidarity. So much of the sense of neighborhood, of community, of identity is based on the understanding that actually in India, people experience enmity in solidarity itself. And I think that's the space for dialogue and the ways in which we can think about generating further questions about how we think about democratic politics and the right to engage with these distinctions. So the distinctive solidarities collaging or emerging into a pattern are accompanied by the possibility of accusations of traitoring. So each side refers to the other as traitoring, the very nature of identity and social relationship. The citizen is negated and becomes imbued with a vociferous nationalism. So each citizen believes that he or she represents an ideology, a space which either encourages reinterpretation of the past or the presentation of the continuing homogeneity and the argument for solidarity based on homogeneity as a patriotic impulse. So this is overpowering in its collaborative grammar, which relates capitalism and religious homogeneity together. So in some senses, the machinery works so fast and so vociferously. So where capitalism and religious homogeneity begin to collaborate, there's very little possibility of negotiating out of the matrix which is informed as the total necessity for the 21st century. So Paul Gilroy writes that race and nation, the higher and the lower, become integrated in this vocabulary in the life of the camps. So you don't have to go very far to see that when it comes to to the collation of interests, which is basic survival, then really the space of disasters bring people together where they might be informed by their religious identity or their caste location, but the very nature of survival means that they have to transcend these. And yet the sociologist's data is always about how this hierarchy is constantly brought back for public viewing. So this solidarity is enforced by religious means, by citing the stranger or the other, that is somebody who cannot be included. And it is about the technological institution, I quote, about the technological institution or political collectivities to which one can be compelled to belong. So there is no choice. One is forced to believe that one can only exist if one accepts the compulsion to belong to one camp or the other. And that is why I think his book is called Between Camps. What happens to the people who cannot conform? So the turn to religiosity is often represented through the appearance of new gods, goddesses, demons, all in furious battle. So the very basis of the truth of religious identity and of religious representation, all of these become extremely potent in terms of possibility of internecine warfare, along with the continuous acceptance of scientific demands to comply to the state's vaccination drives. So I think this sets up a very interesting space for us in terms of how we define the secular codes of the Indian nation state, where science is represented in terms of its efficacy, and yet the multiverse and multi-language that is set up in terms of the generation of new gods, goddesses, demons, new locations of identity, and the denial of other people's gods in relationship to the dominant god who is represented in the nation state as possibly the one God. So we have not moved to monotheism. There's no question of that. I think India represents a plurality of these religious experiences. It represents many different ways in which cultic interpretation, the Ishtadeva, all of these are represented as the legitimate right to be who one is and to be able to follow faith that is accorded by ascription, that is birth, and the possibility that there may be transformation, which is also a constitutional imperative, that the idea that this metanoia or transformation may happen because of experiential spaces, and yet the state and people are always alert to the ways in which demographic issues are raised with regard to conversion. So that's a very specialized debate. And we have to understand for sociologists, gods and goddesses are representations of the societies which acknowledge them. So when humans forget their gods, the gods die. So that's a basic sociological principle. So you can see it for the Egyptian gods, for the Greek gods, for the Roman gods. You can see it in every village hamlet where faceless stone gods have disappeared, where in some senses the representation of the Sanskritic gods have asserted themselves in terms of the primacy of Maryada Ram, where the very negotiation of identity is then extolled as a virtue. So as sociologists, we need to understand that we are dealing with something which is very intense, that people feel very deeply, that the very negotiation of identity, of faith, of experience, all of this is extremely powerful. And we have to understand the ways in which we negotiate with the debate itself. So the power of God is internalized in the human psyche as the ideas which embody divinity appear to humans through dreams and revelation. So each person feels that their god or their goddess is extremely important to them. And so children are exposed to religious idea from birth, and the images develop very clearly in his or her mind. But even in an atheist family, which is a constitutional right posed as a freedom not to believe, and this is a very basic human right, even in an atheist family, the relation between microcosm and macrocosm is understood through the goals which are placed before him or her as he or she is being socialized. So ideologies can provide the sense of the sacred, and that's why sociologists prefer to deal with the question of the sacred, because the sacred is always a shifting category, and we need to understand the way in which the sacred transforms social reality. So in this case, human rights can be a charter, and moral duties can be presented as transcending good and evil. But we know also that the right to life or the right to kill are presented as acts arising from consent to a common code. So, what is that code? I mean, how do we understand the basic assumption that if India is changing rapidly, then we have to deal with the ways in which the consent to that code is being presented? And that the right to kill might very well be the basis of a theory of neglect. So whether it is women, whether it is tribals, whether it's Muslims, I think we have to understand the space in which this notion of the primacy of a certain martial order is masculinist and will represent itself as sacred, will represent itself as the ultimate good. And as human beings, recognizing each other as human beings, we have to work with all those who are left out of the sacred circle of the chosen. So the very nature of difference is thus presented as oppositional spaces within which the individual has to carve his, her own path. Whether it is food or marriage, choices of residence, work or friendship, the very nature of agency is presented as a vocabulary of choice. This subjectivity is then mapped into the overt or the covert, depending upon the ability to reveal the groups of which one is a part of. So, for 70 years, the RSS was repressed. So, in some senses, when we think of such a long history of repression and of not being visible, then we have to understand that the spaces which they occupy is, in some senses, represented as their right to return to a sacralized geography of which only the chosen may be seen as efficacious or having a right to the very nature of identity as an Indian. So, surveillance society does not preclude the right to choice, as people know that they are watched, but they still believe they have the freedom of the right to expression and communication. So, compulsory military service may be presented as a religious goal or secular orientation to citizenship identity. So, COVID-19 brought adherence to the commands of religious authority and of the regulating authority. So, if there was no adherence, there could be severe punishment. So, I think a lot of the ways in which Kerala was blamed because people ate beef, because there were 30% Muslims, 30% Christians, because it was seen in some senses not adhering to the norms of what is presented as the regulating authority. All of these are very visible to us. And I think the act of description itself helps us to understand where we are placed. So it's not necessary for us as social scientists to agree with each other, because I think ideology plays a very strong part and all our biases become very evident. So ostracism by the local community was one aspect. So cohesiveness was brought about by consent to the lockdown. Everybody agreed that it was necessary. So the months of March and April passed very slowly. Curfew was too strong a word to use. People withdrew voluntarily into the inner precincts of their house or found that they were interned in spaces which brought them into intimate danger, as there were no borders or boundaries to keep them in. So either one was enclosed in the house or one was enclosed in camps. And in these camps, there was no knowing what the next day would bring or what the transitory nature of being circled by police, by armed guards, by fences. Nobody in those camps had any idea whether they would live to see the next day. So these then became the internment camps of the migrant workers, who found that they were dependent on state handouts of food and water, which involved standing in long queues. So we've all seen that for months, absolutely. I'm sure it's very clear even now that the very danger and the suffering that people experience was the sense of them not belonging. And that's really what we are concerned with. So religious organizations and voluntary organizations began to help. So by the beginning of June 2020, the lockdown began to show its fearsome qualities as people realized that the cycles of infection and reinfection were continuing. So sociology from its inception in the 19th century represented the idea of God, the holy, as a social construct. So, ideologies of homogenization of any cult are therefore threatened by social analysis. So, the very nature of God's existence depends on a language which is consistent with a known imagery. The idea of the unknown God is a riddle which is answered through the presence or the manifestation of God. So to be present is in some ways a mutual condition. That is the acknowledgement of the existence of God and the acknowledgement that human beings are recognized by God. It's a mutuality, and that is the bestowing of grace. So to be present in some ways in this mutual condition, the bestowing of grace, is something that we as sociologists find very hard to question, because it's really the intended or unintended consequence of this relationship that is established between the idea of the transcendent and the many different ways in which the transcendent is represented in varieties of religious faiths, beliefs, and cults. So, Joan of Arc is famously known to have said in her testimony that even if he forgets me, even if God forgets me, I shall not forget him. This is the ultimate trope of the believer, that the seeker presents the existence of God as a searching for the truth. It is in this aspect that the Shilpakar, the Murtikar, every housewife, every artisan becomes a significant conveyor of symbols and traditions for a variety of languages and symbolic meanings. So, actually, when we look at the whole question of a 5,000 year civilization, we are returning to the ways in which lower caste, Dalits, Shudra identities are represented in terms of the facilitation of art and craft, which is often through religious mediums. So, one of the problems of being poor is being treated by people, not just by the politicians and or bureaucrats, as if they, as a class, do not have the right to exist. So this can be heartbreaking for humans who, when they're born, arrive in the cosmos in terms of what is called the accident of birth. So the poverty that is the condition of 80% of our people is something they don't argue with. So now people say 70% is the farming community, but we know that it is 80% because we saw them in the summer months of 2020. We saw in the ways which are now ineradicable the question of the relationship of the city to the countryside. Something they don't argue with, that is, the poor, they don't argue with this. So they are from rural areas and maybe marginalized farmers, landless labor, and craftspeople. So that is what is so interesting for us, that the whole space of the consensus theory of caste, which ruled academic circles for decades, was upturned by the coming and the emergence of the rural intelligentsia. So we find that the rural intelligentsia now is threatened by a lack of education, because the closing down of universities or the crunching of funds, which is equivalent, really problematizes the way in which we can think of university education as a basic human right. So, what is constrained on the poor is the idea of the Ana Jana philosophy of the Indians. So, this Ana Jana philosophy essentially means that time is finite, that there is a certain span of life, which we all know is 40 or 45 years. And the middle class and the elderly are able to extend it because of the financial abilities that they have to extend their life beyond this particular medium. So this is what is interesting, that early on they were socialized, the poor, they were socialized into a particular ideology which communicates that they're paying for their past errors. And this has nothing to do essentially with lack of education or with corrupt politicians insistent on spending crores, as we know, on building statues rather than feeding the declassed and the poor. So whichever the party, I wish to communicate, that there is a certain neglect of the poor, which is very fundamental and which is surely something which should preoccupy us in terms of the legal right to identity and to life itself. So as poverty is widespread in India and people don't crumble in the face of disaster, a certain philosophy that some people are replaceable begins to develop. So this ideology often applies to all those others who are seen to be weaker sections of society. So it's not just the poor, it's also lower caste communities, tribal people, minorities, third gender individuals, and women. So the attitude of dominant groups is to treat them as rubbish or refuse. So it is a predatory space by which only those who have access to consumption can hope to survive. The rest are neglected to the extent where they are seen to be rubbish or refuse. So Sigmund Bauman, in his book Wasted Lives, argues that along with the idea that there is a class of people which is treated as if they are the underbelly of society or the underdogs of society, because they're unwanted, unreliable, unemployable, uneverything, he confirms that there is the idea that consumption is the only thing that makes any sense. So it is extremely tragic that the mountains of waste, which is created by an obsessiveness to own ever new things, which are never fully owned or utilized, begins to overrun the landscape. Nothing now can be seen except in every city or by every railway track, masses of waste, which the unfortunate who do not have access to anything at all must now begin to excavate and sort. So the resistance to curtailing desires, which is necessary for humans to survive, has now been forced on us by COVID-19. The enormity of the deaths, the vulnerability of populations to this disease has led to the change in worldview of many who had earlier not converted to the austerity and Greens debate. So I think across party people, they do hold hands over ecological issues. I think it's a one thing which unites Indians. The tree covers, has gone up. So the very spaces of the ways in which this language of democracy, of sharing a common world, of the possibilities that in spite of our differences, we can engage with each other on these very important issues. I think that is the most important need of the hour. I think it's a democratic right to have ideologies which are different from each other. And I think that the human rights question is really about the ways in which these may be put aside, the very question of the right to life or the right to existence or the right to a tomorrow. If these are put aside, then legally, judicially, these should be very, very significant to your generation, because the hope for the future lies in your discernment. So migrant workers have been most affected in this pandemic. So according to the Aziz Premji University survey, 5 million workers would have moved from urban location in the first phase of COVID-19 because of adverse urban housing, hoping to return to their villages and safe ground. So the warriors were always the nurses and the doctors because they were continually in contact with patients. But we have to look at the role of the judiciary and the role of the journalists, because they, in some senses, represented the possibility that human rights would be forefront in the national debates, and the continual encounter of young people and the possibility that they hope for a safe world. This is the question that was raised by the media on an everyday basis. So the media has actively reported the difficulties of their condition and brought to us the most puzzling and tragic difficulties relating to food, water, survival of laborers and workers trying to catch buses and trains to go home. The death toll has been frightening, as workers were often put on buses, on trains in very terrible summer conditions without adequate food or water, in trains which were quite haphazard and complex in their routes and destinations, if at all they arrived. So these images are so heartbreaking that India will never forget the year that disease overtook the land. Those who walked hundreds of kilometers in the hot sun were equally at risk, if not more so, than travelers on public transport, and pictures of hungry people with calloused feet, dying men and women and children became our daily media feed. So when we look at landless wage laborer, we ask how many of them are farmers, artisans, migrant labor often consists of skilled weavers, goldsmiths, sculptors, workers in wood, metal, ivory, and vegetable dyes. Can we even begin to evaluate the loss in terms of abilities when they arrive in the city to carry out work which is remunerative as bricklayers or sewer cleaners? Do we ever ask or do we ever conduct surveys to know what the talents and skills of the working class population is? There's just the assumption that this is cheap labor. There's just the assumption that they are without homes and family. So the very basis of these generalizations are increasingly problematic, as we have seen over this last year. So when we look at disease, we have to ask, do workers have immunity? Access to food, water, shelter, medical help, education, money, and power, this is limited. So 80% is not able to access these. And so activists helping them also fall ill and die because of bad roads, inability to reach hospital, inability to communicate the nature of their illness. So in the case of food distribution, there were tragic calamities, and videos filmed by news journalists across channels showed us that granaries are full, but grain rots when it is not redistributed. So there's a solution to this problem, and that is to learn from our mistakes. And I think this is the need of the hour, that we actually must use the spaces that we have, because you have to understand that the location that you have as young people essentially allows you to plan for the future. So yes, politicians have their dreams. Yes, corporate houses have their abilities. So I think the joint stock company has implicated maybe 50% of the population in terms of its access to joint stock companies. They feel that they belong to the three corporate houses which rule our country. So the very negotiation of this is something that young people have to work with. Do we see a class assimilation within a particular uh, range of access to consumer goods as the limit of our ambitions, or do we see the way in which we can contribute towards the future? So I'll stop here and take questions. So thank you for your patience, and I'm happy to answer as you put your questions to me.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for such a wonderful address. Ma'am, there are a couple of questions from the audience. The first one would be, ma'am, that how do you think, or well, what is your suggestion to strengthen this unorganized labor sector that you were just speaking about in our country? How do we exactly empower or strengthen them in to at least be better suited or better placed in this country?
So I think institutionally speaking, that's such an important goal, because you have to be able to generate the materials and information required by which middle class people like you, upper middle class people, wealthy people, because when we look at education today, it's really accessible only to a certain class of people. That's what frightens us as sociologists, because the possibility that there'll be freedom, mobility. Yes, mobility takes 3 generations or 100 years, but we understand that it is a possibility. Now that is taken away from the poor. So the only ways in which we can negotiate with the fact of institutional support to them is by the production of information which can be distributed, disseminated, and made publicly available. And I think this has been done rapidly, because the way that the country is moving is towards an oligarchy, where the relationship between capitalist modes of production, industrialized farming, I mean, it's a very tricky moment historically speaking, because you must remember that when there was recession all over um, South Asia, India survived because of post office economies. I mean, I think that's a very thrilling moment for us to remember that the so-called poor were actually putting in money into post offices, and when there was a great deal of pressure on the banks, India came through that period with such startling clarity. So I think we must be able to trust the farmers, because what we have to understand is that this huge population that we have, the intelligence that it has, the survival skill it has, goes back 200,000 years. Our lineages are 200,000 years. It's not, 2,000 years or 500 years or 5,000 years. We have to understand the very nature of our ability to have survived so many odds. So when we look at the ways in which the farming communities have supported themselves and the very basis by which they've already always grown food for themselves. Many of our questions as sociologists is how much fertilizer is being added to the materials which are produced for the market of which we are consumers and buyers. So those debates were also very significant for us. So that is why many of us were following niche farming and organic farmers to see what is the potential for the future when we know that all the studies showed us that chemical industrial farming, GMT farming was problematic in terms of understanding the human constitution. So I think the first step is to acknowledge that there is this huge world which is still in existence, and ideologies are ideologies. We become assimilated through forms of socialization. And it's not necessary that we shrug them off. I don't know if it's possible to shrug off these forms of socialization because that means losing your family, right? But I'm saying that as young people, you can put the wedge into the questions of the survival of your children and grandchildren. And that's the important moment that is being placed before you. So, what climate change brings to all of you is a question of a certain egalitarianism, which is bounded by the very nature of exigency. Everybody becomes equal when they're standing in queues. So, the question of how we deal with the possibility that, again, the economy favors some and neglects others, that will work for a few years. But after that, there will be only negation and destruction. So my feeling is that there is an ideological leap towards a space age which is being propelled, and everybody is supposed to march in line with that ambition, and everything else is sidelined. I think the coexistence of these is possible. I mean, I would really argue that we have to be prepared for everything from, natural extinction, geological time, the destruction of the earth. We've been informed, every generation knows about it. So the catastrophes that have been represented from the 19th century onwards affects our notion of how we think about time, how we think about the future. But if there's a socialization which says there is no tomorrow, I think that's unfair to new generations which are yet to come. So we have to be prepared for them, and we have to be able to provide the solidarities that are made available by the richness of our land and all that it represents. And that is what I think the farmers are asking today. They're saying they want the right to plow the land and to feed their families and to make decisions about how they will sell the produce. So I think that if it's something which the prime minister said, do what you like, I mean, that is speech. But we must be able. So there is a moment where the whole panoply opens up, but it is not sufficient. There has to be a space where democratization and the ways in which we think of organic farming, the shift away from industrial capitalist agriculture, because that's not going to feed the population. And I think a population is very precious for us, and that's what our voting queues always tell us, isn't it? That democracy is alive because they do believe.
It's true. And that's correct. And one more question that us as lawyers would ask a sociologist is that, coming back to the topic of labor risk, particularly because in this post-COVID scenario that we saw during the COVID phase, that do you feel that we need some special legislations, particularly that will help us strengthen the labor service conditions? So that we do not see them just as a homogenized mass, or we can give them better protection in terms of who they are, what their rights are. Do you think we need something special other than what is existing currently?
You have to ask for it because at the moment, right to information, the questions of occupational hierarchy between employer and employee, all these have been placed as if they're non-negotiable, right? So you have to ask for things, you have to ask for what you want. So institutional mechanisms have to be in place where the very dignity of academic exercise, within which I think legal systems are so significant because there's always trust. But we have to remember that where ideologies are concerned, there is no questioning. And that is the real problem that faces your generation. That if there is no freedom to question, but one has to succumb to the very blanket statement of what is feasible, then the small span of time which is left to you, that will also be taken away. So if the question of totalitarianism, if the question of lack of democratic impulses, if the question of surveillance and all that it entails in terms of not having freedom of speech, because the very fact that you felt free to invite me, that communicates that you still believe that there is freedom of speech, right? So these are very healthy institutional signs. So if we are to see the ways in which lawyers negotiate with one another, there's always the solidarity of friendship, collegiality. We see this among the politicians themselves. So it's always very interesting to look at the photographs. I think visual anthropology has become very significant because right across the history of India, that is, I'm talking about the freedom movement onwards, these photographs become available to us in terms of how much cross-talking and hand-holding there is between different ideologies and different political parties. So lawyers know it more than anybody else. But there is continuous hand-holding across political parties. That is why the Indian citizen is not really able to make any distinction between political parties anymore. So that's the unnerving aspect of Indian politics today, that there is a similarity right across. So I think if you as a community are going to ask questions, raise problems, then you're doing what you can do. But if for whatever reason that is not permitted to you, what would your response be?
I think we are facing that question and we are facing that challenge more so now ever than before, I would say. That we talked about hand holding between the ideologies. We can see that opposing views are not particularly there to question or to ask for a change as we should. So, ma'am, last question in this regard, and maybe then we can wind up, is that what industry-wise, and we are going a little bit to the economic sector, is that do you think that this large-scale displacement from the laborers from metropolitan areas back to their homes and this, do you think this will create an economic impact that we will be able to see or measure? Or will this also be brushed under the rug and it will not have any significance as to how we deal with the issue?
So it's a waiting game because the state has infinite patience. So the point is that the political party is not the state. The political party is an incumbent of the state. So that patience is only representative of electoral politics and the ways in which voters have communicated that oligarchy is acceptable to them. So that is the way in which the state is now functioning, and it has a time space of a few years. So within that period of time, unless there is an ethical preoccupation of the rights of human life to exist on planet Earth, because this is something which is happening across the world, and people are being pushed out, whether for geological reasons or for political ones. So the nature of our quest here is really to ensure that these rights are at least recorded in terms of how we present arguments. But if we are saying that there is no possibility of freedom, no possibility of justice, no possibility of rights, that human rights would be seen as something which is a Western concept and not implicit to Indian reality, then the freedom movement, which ran for 150 years, enters into a vacuum because these rights were fought for. So it was a slow negotiation in terms of how power was encapsulated in the hands of the least powerful. So I think it's important to go back to the debates on Narendra Dev and the ways in which we look at peasant communities, peasant associations. So he was vice chancellor, but was able to represent political authority and political immediacy. So obscure today. But I think there are so many spaces in which, when we look at how these debates generate questions for us today, So I think we have a right to our lives. I think we have a right to our privacy. We have a right to the world which we have, or which we are not owners of. But we imagine that it is there. But what COVID-19 showed us is that each person is substitutable and anybody can die. So it was not something which was left to the elderly to think about and to imagine. It became everybody's everyday question, to wake up in the morning, to be surprised, relieved, and to understand that there was no way by which this could be chronicled or recorded. So what we lost was a sense of apathy or boredom. We were just so delighted by the fact that we are alive. I mean, that's something which informs us every day. The gratitude that we are still here on this beautiful planet. So I think, I mean, the fact that all of you are the age you are, I think there's tremendous energy, but danger lies at every corner. So there has to be a choice about what you do and how you think and how you represent your thoughts and the choices you make. You can't stop people from doing what they do. You can't stop yourselves from asking the questions that you do. So you have to have the sense of liberation that comes from being young. I think that is on your side. And it's something which is, people are waiting for that, space of feeling that they're at home in the world. Nobody wants to feel that they're going to be pushed out either by fate or by the state. So it could happen to anybody. And I think women are targeted. I think Kshatriya Raj, as the Prime Minister said, that is something which is being openly acclaimed, but it was never kind to women. So martiality is something which, men enjoy, but for women, it's tremendous pain, it's tremendous agony. So the very nature of warfare means losses which are continuous. So it's something that we have to see as a personal choice about where we belong. I don't think we can take away the right of others to choose what they do. That would be very difficult in democratic India. But if we lose this notion of democracy, then we won't have any questions, any rights, any freedoms, any possibility of hoping or thinking about the future. So there will be other ways in which we are cordoned off, and this could happen to to even the most powerful.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you for addressing our questions for this wonderful, wonderful lecture that you
Well,
have given
thank
us today.
you. Thank you so much.
And with this, we are moving towards the end of this event. I also thank all the participants who are present here, the faculty members, and the co-hosting team of Mr. Karan, Harshita Manogya, and of course Mr. Kush Kalra, who has been organizing this event. So thank you very much. Thank you, ma'am, and a good day to everyone who is present.
Delighted to have been here. Thank you for asking me.